start in prayer. I know we've got some more people signed up who said they'd be joining us, and I'm sure they will be coming in, and we'll let them come in as they come in. But let's open in prayer. Loving God, we thank you that you are a God of new beginnings, that you are always helping us to grow and to change into the next best version of ourselves, into the next best version of our churches. We ask your Spirit to be poured out on us today, to guide us to be the leaders that the church needs for these tumultuous times. We give you thanks for this time, for the fellowship, and for the learning we will be doing, and ask that you bless it all. Amen. Well, thank you. If you are just coming in, we are very happy to have Reverend Dr. Doug Powe with us. He is the director of the Lewis Center for Church Leadership at Wesley Theological Seminary, as well as professor of evangelism and urban ministry. Is that still correct? That is still correct. And I know he has a special heart and interest for research in church revitalization, I'm sure, along with many other things. And I will let you introduce yourself here, but welcome. Thank you so much for being with the ministers of the Christian Church Capital area this afternoon.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And first, let me just say hi to Reverend Brown. I have not seen her in a long time, so it is wonderful to see you. So I want to give that shout out. But I am Doug Powe, director of the Lewis Center for Church Leadership at Wesley Theological Seminary. And at the Lewis Center, our work focuses on really trying to resource congregations like yours and helping them to sort of know what's going on in terms of trends, but also to hopefully give you some practical ideas that you can use in your congregation that will better equip you to not only connect with the people in the congregation currently, but also to connect with people outside the doors of the congregation. So we have a lot of free resources in case you have not connected with the Lewis Center. So www.churchleadership.com, and you can find some of our free resources that may be helpful to you. Today, my task is to talk about leading during sort of turbulent times. And I'm going to share my PowerPoint so we can get started. And it's my plan today to hopefully talk somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 35 minutes if it goes well. Then to have you all to talk for about 5 minutes in small groups to sort of reflect upon what I've shared, and then to take some questions for the rest of our time together. So that's where we're sort of headed today. I want to begin with this Romans text that I think is sort of helpful in framing our conversation. Many of you are familiar with Romans 12, verses 1 through 2 from Paul. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good and pleasing and perfect will. This particular text, as you will see, I'm going to focus on really verse 2 and want to begin with conforming and think about sort of the patterns in the United States and in the world to a certain extent. And this idea of conforming, I think, particularly recently has sort of helped to shape some of the turbulent times that we are experiencing. particularly in the United States context. And I've listed out just a few. We could talk about many more, but I feel like these are really important now and sort of are undergirding why we're having some of the other issues we face today. So the first is the tendency to listen to those who already support our perspective. So regardless of which side of the fence you're on, the tendency is I'm a Fox News person or I'm a MSNBC person, so that there's this divide of the information we seek comes from those who already support the perspectives that we share. So that is sort of reflecting back to us that which we already believe. And so in that way, I think we're sort of conforming to the pattern of the world. Second is because of social media and technology, which are wonderful things, but also it has moved us to a place where sound bites have become the way that we often engage one another over sort of a prolonged engagement or conversation. So that in communicating in sound bites, in this case, I'm thinking of Twitter, there's only so much that can be said, and a lot gets left unsaid. So it's easy to misinterpret what is being said, and it's also easy not to fully engage or explain something that requires more than a sound bite. So communicating in sound bites, I believe, also creates challenges for us today. The third one I think is particularly important. It's hard to get a consensus for what is true. And here I'm thinking about many people argue we're sort of moved into this place of post-modernity. We move from modernity to post-modernity. And a part of post-modernity is a questioning of the truth and what is true. And I think that all of those things can be helpful and good. But a part of that then means, then how do we come to an agreement for what is true? And I put a couple of examples that have been in the news. And again, I'm not caring which side of the political party you're on, but certainly there were individuals and are still individuals who question whether or not COVID-19 exists. So is that true? More recently, there are individuals that would argue that Russia is not actually invading Ukraine, but is protecting Ukraine. So the issue becomes, if everything is true, then how do we come to a consensus for what is really happening? And that can become a real challenge for us during these times. And then finally, what I have listed, and this one is really of personal interest to me, that the I find sort of challenging today, is that we've lost the ideal of the common good. That that there was a time, I feel, where we truly believed our role was to contribute to and to some extent to sacrifice for the common good. But now it is a feeling of what is more important is sort of our individual ideas and freedoms, and this idea of the common good has been lost in that mix. So just throwing out these patterns and thinking about these patterns as buying into sort of conforming, the question then becomes, how do we not conform to these patterns? And more importantly, for what I've been asked to do, how do we help others not to conform to these patterns? So it's one thing to talk about ourselves, but then it's another to actually lead people to not conform to these patterns. And I want to start by thinking about leadership for a few minutes and begin with sort of four characteristics of leadership. And there are many ways to talk about leadership. I want to say that up front. Today, What I want to begin with in light of this conversation is leadership begins with the people that God has given us. And I think that this is critically important and true that oftentimes it's easy to think about leading in such a way that it becomes abstract, that we're trying to lead something to accomplish something for this huge group or a group of people we may not even know. And the reality is that God has given us a group of people, and as pastors, um, it's the congregation that we often lead, and that's the group of people that God has put in front of us to help influence, to make a difference in the world. Certainly, it's not a perfect group. If you are the pastor of a congregation or leading, there are many stories I'm sure you can tell about the and trying to lead people, how challenging that can be at times. But it's still the group that God has given us to lead. The beauty of this means that we, because we are building relationships with this group, are able to unearth the assumptions in the group as it relates to ways we are conforming in the world. We are able to listen, and they are often willing to listen to us because we have built relationships with those individuals. So beginning with the people that God has given us means we're beginning with a group of people with whom we have a relationship, with whom we can influence, and they also can influence us to make a difference in the world. And if we begin there, we have a better chance of actually tackling some of the challenges and issues that are confronting us. But as we think about doing that, the next thing I would say is we have to help God's people take the next faithful step. This idea comes from Scott Kermode, who does leadership, and he talks about what is the next faithful step. I think about this next faithful step in relationship to participating in God's work and helping to move closer to heaven on earth. And for that reason, the next faithful step is not something we are doing by ourselves, but it's a step that is done in participation and trying to draw closer to God and God's work. But what is key for the next faithful step is, depending on our situation, the next faithful step for us really has to be discerned. So, for example, it may be we decide providing housing for Ukrainian family is the next faithful step, and how we can help address the challenges that are taking place with the war in Ukraine. We aren't able to go over and fight in the war itself or able to do other things. But the next faithful step for us is we can provide housing for a family so that they will be safe and can escape what is taking place in the country. So as we are sort of focusing on the people that God has given us, then what we have to do is discern with that group what is the next faithful step for us that we can do to make a difference as we seek to address many of the challenges that are before us. And I don't have it here on the slide, but one of the things I also will say is was extremely hard, and I'll speak for myself, is that there are a lot of wonderful ideas and a lot of things that you can do. And of course, there are limited resources for what can be done. So, a part of thinking about the next faithful step is we can't do everything, but what is the one thing that we can do that is going to help? And then after we accomplish that, it may be we can then take the next faithful step after that, which would be something else. But we want to be careful that we're not trying to tackle too much at the same time. It's easy to fall into that trap. And that can end up actually hurting the effort instead of helping the effort. So taking the next faithful step, but really focusing what it is that we do. The next thing that I think is really important then is the next faithful step may not be a big step. Oftentimes, it's easy to get caught in this trap of wanting to make a huge splash. Um, if going back to the civil rights movement, if you talk to individuals, everybody marched with King and was at all of the big events that took place during that time. And of course, the reality is that's not true. Uh, but everybody saw that in hindsight as really participating in sort of the really big things that were taking place. But if you listen to many of the individuals who actually participated during that time, and King himself, if you listen to some old recordings or writings, has talked about there would be individuals during that time that they would purposely ask not to participate in the protests because the role of these individuals would be to go bail them out of jail when they knew they were going to get arrested when they would go protest. So they had an important role to play, but that role was not actually in the protest itself. So we have to remember the next faithful step for us may not be the big protest or something else, but it's critically important because if there weren't the people to bail them out of jail, then they would have had a problem because they would have been stuck. So everybody has an important role, and it's by working together that we can make a difference. So every step is important, even though it may seem like some steps are smaller than other steps. But the key is helping everybody to understand that the role they play is going to help us to eventually get to where we want to move, as with the civil rights movement. And finally, the last one is power can be shared. I think particularly today that this one is challenging. We tend to treat power like pie. To tell on myself again, I love apple pie, particularly my mom's apple pie. So I always tried to get the biggest piece in the family, which means that others get a smaller piece of pie. And that's the way we tend to treat power, is that if I get a bigger piece, that means others are going to get a smaller piece. But the reality is that if we use power in the biblical sense, it's more about how we are able to influence others and they're able to influence us to work towards making a difference in something. So if we are working together, we can actually expand the power we have. It doesn't subtract the power. So we have to think about power differently. We've gotten caught in this sort of partisan politics where we think about subtracting power, that if I win, that means you're going to lose. Instead of thinking about how is it we can actually do something together that's going to make a difference for the whole. And if we think about leading people in that way, I think it can make a difference for actually moving towards transformation in a good way. So then the second piece of that text has to do with renewing our minds. And for me, as we think about how we renew our minds so we aren't conforming to sort of the patterns of this world, is eschatology. I think one of the greatest gifts that we have as Christians is sort of the ideal or the concept of eschatology. That eschatology means that even though we live in a world where we know there's violence, racism, sexism, denial of sexual orientation, and we can go on and on and on, that the gift we have is that we are called to point people to the possibility of a different way of existing where heaven actually exists on earth, that we're always helping people to see something different, so that as we lead and are leading the transformation during these times, eschatology really is the grounding, in my opinion, theologically, that helps us to move people to a different place. And remember that we have to keep our minds wrapped around that although what we may be experiencing now is hurtful, painful, and all these things, we are called to paint a picture of what is possible, um, sort of out there that we can't quite see or touch. Going back to King one more time, the power of his "I Have a Dream" speech, if you get a chance, go back and listen to it again, is he does exactly this. He acknowledges sort of the challenges at that time of what was taking place, but the picture he paints is of what is possible, of where we can go, um, and move towards if we work together, to go in that direction. So the way that we need to renew our minds is eschatologically pointing people to, heaven existing on earth, so that we can actually live differently together. And I think this gift that we have is what separates us in some ways from the work that others do, and also trying to make a difference. But is also a gift that we really need to make sure that we really take advantage of, really buying into that we are sharing with people a vision that is powerful, that even though they may not quite be able to touch it, is still real. The challenge of this, of course, is, what does this look like? And I'm offering sort of, one way to think about this: spiritual, mental, and practical. Spiritual is thinking in sort of my Wesleyan language of what we call works of piety. So this is prayer, reading the scripture, holy conversations, sacraments, these things that draw us closer to God, open us up to the Holy Spirit, so that we can really hopefully discern and hear from God in a different way. So that, in scripture, we see this idea that God sees us all the same and created in God's image, where there's neither Jew nor Greek. Mentally, it means that the way we understand the world has to shift, that we begin to see the world actually through different lenses. Um, so that individuals who think that a person of color is not smart, encounters 10 African American Rhodes Scholars, so that it starts to shift their mindset for what then is possible when we start defining or thinking about this. And then it's practical. We actually act upon and do things differently based upon, what we're sort of discerning from God and the shift that is taking place for us mentally. So the work we're doing in our congregations is hopefully influencing them to renew their minds in this way, so that they can also influence others who may not be in our churches, um, to shift the way that they're renewing their minds. The challenge with all of this, of course, because all of what I said sounds great and lovely and all of that wonderful stuff, is, going to Ron Heifetz, um, who's at Harvard, says, the problem is not change itself, but the problem is the fear of loss. Um, so I'll say that again. The problem is not change itself. The problem is the fear of loss. That individuals struggle with changing because they fear they're losing something. Um, we're not talking about congregations today to a certain extent, but this is why it's so hard to get a congregation to do something different. If you're talking about changing worship, the reason people don't want to change worship is not change itself, but they fear they're losing something, when you, move away from what they have been doing to try to do something else. So it's the fear of loss that is really challenging. So spiritually, that means that I have to open myself up to a new possibility. Um, and I have to then maybe give up what I have believed all along. Mentally, it means that if I'm shifting to something new, then what I thought about before was wrong. And practically, it feels like I'm going against my own interests. So when we are trying to do this work of leading people during turbulent times, particularly to be transformed and to do something different, we have to remember that it's the fear of loss for why it's so hard to get people to move and to think differently about where it is we're trying to lead them. The other thing I would say is what we tend to do is focus on the practical change, but ignore sort of the spiritual and the mental. That what I mean by this is we make an argument that getting vaccinated so we can protect people, and this will help us to solve the pandemic. And it's absolutely a reasonable sort of argument and a very practical argument. But if people are opposed to it, we haven't actually helped them to shift, particularly mentally, to see things through different lenses. So we have to do more than just help people to understand the practical reason to change. We actually have to give them new lenses to help them to see things differently, which will then help them to make the shift that is necessarily for the practical change. And again, that's really hard work. It's work that's not going to come easy, and it's going to take place over probably a period of time, but that's the sort of important work that is necessary if we actually want to see people move to a different place. So often for this type of change to happen, it requires a disruption, something that's going to interrupt the status quo. The person who sort of talked about this sort of disruptive change was named Clayton Christensen. And he talked about disruptive change and sort of sustaining change. So the sustaining are the things we continue to do because we do not want to completely abandon what we're doing, and we don't want people to completely, lose who they are. But at the same time, we do want people to move, in many cases, to a different place to see things differently. And that often requires some form of a disruption for that to happen. Of course, in the Bible, disruption doesn't work the same as it does in the business world, of which he is, making this argument for. So I want to be clear that when we're thinking about disruption in our context, it's going to work a little bit differently. I've given an example of the Acts text, and actually, let me jump ahead. So in the Acts text, if you think about Peter and Peter, before we get to this particular text, has the vision, and separate from Peter, Cornelius has the vision about the Gentiles. That vision becomes a disruption in the lives of both Peter and Cornelius for something different happening that they at that point did not believe was possible. It eventually moves them to thinking differently about how they see the world, and then actually acting differently based upon what has taken place. So what happens is there's an interruption of the norm because of the vision that they have seen. And this interruption means that now Paul becomes the apostle to the Gentiles who before this weren't perceived to be a part of what was taking place. And circumcision doesn't go away, but circumcision is not perceived in the same way as necessary to sort of worship God. So it's not completely given up, circumcision, but it's perceived differently in the role that it plays. So we still have these disruptions that help us to see things differently in the Bible, and I would argue in our context, but we have to sort of think about and work with and interpret those disruptions a little bit differently than you would in the business world. So thinking about this in terms of um, the pandemic certainly caused huge disruptions for all of us, where we had to do a lot of praying for insight. But what it did in many of our communities is we had to really shift the way we understood community. We were used to coming together, um, being physically together, but we had to shift to understanding the possibility of doing community virtually. So this altered the way that we thought about community. In many congregations, as we sort of are moving out of the pandemic, are having to think about community again differently in a hybrid format where there are people physically together and there are people joining virtually. And how do we bring those two groups together? So we're having to mentally shift the way that we think about these things because of the disruption of the pandemic. That means that we practically have had to do some different things. Just like we're able to do this on Zoom, we've had to practically use different ways of connecting with one another, um, to continue to do the work of the church. So we altered our practice based upon the sort of shift we had to that had to happen. But what is critically important is almost every congregation was able to sustain worship. They were able to sustain Bible studies. They were able to sustain doing the business of the church. These things were sustained. You were still able to do them. They were done differently, but those things didn't go away. So the key is that even when these disruptions happen, it doesn't mean that you're giving up sort of core pieces of what are critically important. They're happening in a different way than what they previously happened before. I want to skip. So what I'm sort of arguing, with thinking about it in this way is we have to stop bifurcating. It's not always an either or choice. It's not about loss and win. And this is the way we often frame things, which leads to some of the butting of heads. So the easy one to pick on in this case is it's not always Black lives versus blue lives, so that they're pitted against one another. But the reality is there's a way of, by honoring Black lives, we are in fact honoring blue lives. The goal is, how do we help so that we're protecting the lives of individuals so that everybody can fully live into who God has called them to be. So it's not pitting them against one another, but it's how do we honor those lives. So this is a real shift in terms of how we have to think and act, and move forward for this to happen. So that means really dealing with, again, what people feel like they're losing in that instance. The other piece of this is experiment. And I think experimentation is critically important. We do a lot of work around innovation and design thinking where experimentation is critical. And I believe that experimentation allows us to try things and do things without the idea that they have to be perfected. And it allows us to make mistakes, and it gives people room to have grace when those mistakes are made. So in this work of trying to lead people to think differently or to move in a different way during turbulent times, the idea of experimenting, I think, is critically important, because when we experiment, we're not saying that this is the end all be all. What we're saying is we want to try something and learn from it. And then as we're learning, we can alter what it is that we're doing, and move that forward. An example, again, that's coming more from my work in with congregations, it actually comes from when I was in Missouri at my old church, where we wanted to start a second service that was very different from the first service. And anybody who's been to Kansas City knows that the real gospel in Kansas City are the Kansas City Chiefs. That's who everybody actually pays attention to. Um, so what we came up with is saying we want to do an experiment during the football season where we would do a 8 o'clock service so that those individuals could come to church for an hour and still make it to the game in time to watch the Chiefs. And because it will benefited those individuals greatly, they were all for it. Now, our real goal in this case was actually to reach other people in the community. It wasn't necessarily just for those in the congregation, but in selling it to the congregation, they bought into it because they could see the benefit to them, because it related to them being able to see the game. And the fact that we said it was an experiment during the football season, it had a start date and an end date, so that it wasn't something that would go on forever. So an experiment allows people to feel more comfortable because it doesn't feel like you're putting something in place that's going to go on for eternity. When the time came, it went really well and was really successful. We did go back and say, well, it's the end of the season. We said, at this point in time that, we would stop and end it. And they were all, oh, no, you can't stop this. This is wonderful. We got to keep it going. But it was because it was cast as an experiment that we were able to make that happen. So experimentation is critically important. And then evaluate. We have to evaluate the work we're doing. Did we listen well to God and others? Did we stop focusing on what is being lost and try to find ways that we can actually expand and do our work together? Did we develop an experiment that sort of disrupts the way we approach things? And what did we learn that we can improve the experiment as we move it forward? So evaluation is critically important so that as we're trying to lead during these times and we do experiments to try to make a difference, we need to make sure we're actually evaluating the experiment that we've done. So resisting injustice, if we take an issue like race, one way to think about what is at stake is, how is it that we're all created in God's image? And when we think about that, it means that I have to buy into that. If I believe everyone is created in God's image, it doesn't mean that my group is somehow losing out. That by accepting other groups are also made in God's image, it's not taking something away from my particular group. And one way to do this work would be sort of an experiment. We partner with an African American congregation to really talk about policing issues or something else, so that we can sort of think about this together. And then we evaluate to find out what did we learn that will help us to move forward. And to sort of bring it full circle is, if we do this sort of partnering work, going to where I started, this means that I'm leading our congregation, the people that God has given me, to really say, if we're serious about addressing racism, let us begin by partnering with this congregation with a conversation, so that we can really learn from one another. The next faithful step may be developing an understanding around the fears, from each side of how they see policing or how they see other issues. And then if you think about the next step, it may actually be inviting the police to come join the conversation, or someone to be a part of it. So this may not be a huge step, but it can be an important step. And, again, thinking about how power can be shared is how then can we take what we're learning so that we can expand this to treating all people again like they're created in the image of God. So the idea is to really sort of work with sort of the model that I'm given as you're sort of leading the group that God has given you. I don't know that I quite made it just to 12:35, but hopefully I've given you a lot to think about there. And what I want to do is give you about 5 minutes just to sort of unpack what I've said into small groups and then come back and we'll have some conversation for the last about 15 minutes that we have left. So if we can put them in the small groups for about 5 minutes, that would be perfect. All right, I think everyone is either back or will be back shortly. So in the time that we have left, I am looking forward to hearing questions or comments as we get a chance to sort of dialogue.
We had great conversation in our little breakout room, and some of the things that we took away was loving the flexibility of your model, and just with the real issue being of loss when it comes to change. It made at least me reflect on the fact that we don't always have good languages or practices for grief. And I think if we were able to articulate our grief and process it a little bit better, that the change would come easier. And maybe that's something we start with as pastors, but also that we can bring to our people. And Martha brought up a wonderful comment that, we need to be good facilitators to have all of these very difficult conversations as leaders of the church. And maybe one of the things I'm certainly going to think of as the head of the Ministers Association is making sure we have the skills we need to be able to be good facilitators of conversation. That's certainly something that we can strengthen.
Yeah, absolutely. And she is one of the best. So you have a natural resource right there.
We'll talk, Martha,
yeah,
we'll talk.
you have a natural resource right there with you. But yeah, that's absolutely, I think, correct. And I think it's the lost part of something that we all sort of know, but I remember when I read it for the first time, it sort of clicked. It made sense. Is that people aren't really fighting change for the most part. What they're fighting against is they feel like they're giving something up. And if you don't address that, then it's always going to be a struggle. And the same thing comes with leading people during turbulent times is that if you don't really address what people really feel like they're giving up, then it's hard to get them to move or to see something different. Others, questions, comments?
Well, you mentioned the change during the Martin Luther King era. I lived through that era. I saw the change before and after, and lived through that era. And at that time and during this time, change was good for America. And we can't be closed-minded to change. We have to be open-minded, and we just can't be closed-minded. Even during this time of change with this COVID and the vaccines, we can't be closed-minded. We have to be open-minded. We have to be able to see the other side.
Yeah, absolutely true. And part of what I'm arguing is that's the work that we all have, and that's where I think eschatology is so important. And I wish I had the genius of King, particularly when you think of like his "I Have a Dream" speech, of that ability to help people to really see the present and the challenge of the present, but to really paint a picture of we can move towards something that is not really harmful to you, that is actually a better future together.
Amen.
And I think that's the work we've been called to do, and why we are equipped in ways even that others who work on these sort of challenges, but not from a Christian perspective, can't do it as well as us if we really are doing what we do well. So I'm a firm believer that eschatology is critically important in terms of helping us to paint a picture that others really can see things differently.
I agree.
I couldn't help but think of how the pandemic really made us change. And we had no time to even breathe or think about what we were losing, really. It just had to happen.
Yeah.
And so sometimes maybe change has to be that fundamental, that there's nothing or there's change. And if we're going to be together, we're going to learn about this thing called Zoom. And now I really am grateful for it. I know some people are very tired of Zoom meetings, but I wouldn't be able to attend anything if it weren't for Zoom.
Yeah, I mean, this is where disruption is so critical. The pandemic is taking disruption to the nth degree, but what we have to do is be able to create, hopefully not like a pandemic, but disruptions to help people to put on different lenses, and when we're trying to lead them to see things differently. You need that disruption in the same way Peter and Cornelius needed that disruption of the vision, so that they can see things differently that had been ingrained so long into them.
Right.
Douglas, my name is Jeff. I'm the interim regional minister for the Christian Church Capital Area. I was in the small group with B and with Laird briefly. I appreciated the examples that you've given, along with the main points that you're making, examples that are familiar to all of us from either our history or even present time. But I'm also aware that since we landed on this theme, which you've adapted, the times have even become more turbulent. When we landed on the theme, there was no incursion into Ukraine. When we landed on the theme, there was not a supposed determination by the Supreme Court of an issue that is so volatile for society. So I wonder if you could speak to how, really, it seems to me we need to be developing as leaders a mentality, a worldview that allows us to approach every new challenge with these kinds of leadership principles. We don't know what's going to happen next week, but
Right.
They will add to the turbulence.
Yeah, absolutely. I think two things. I think you're right that people sort of saying it half-heartedly, but I think Bart was absolutely 100% correct that as a pastoral leader, that you have the Bible in one hand and a newspaper in the other. Of course, that's the time when that's where you get to think. But his point was that you have to have sort of this global perspective, and understand the connection between the Bible and what's going on in the world to be effective at what you do. And that has not changed, I don't think, at all. What is then critically important, and this gets back to sort of what I was sharing, is that there are constantly going to be issues and challenges that are going to be taking place. And the reality is that they're all important, but we're not going to be able to do something about every single one of them. So that's where I'm arguing we have to really be discerning about what is it that we can do as it relates to some of the challenges or a particular challenge, and where is it that we can partner or participate with others who might be better suited to lead as they address the other challenges, and be willing to work with them. And I think that again is where we think about the importance of working together expands our power, and we don't have to try to do everything ourselves. Because if we're trying to address the situation in Ukraine, if we're trying to address the situation with the Supreme Court, we're trying to address this other thing over here, there's only so many resources to do those things. But if you're leading the effort for Ukraine, somebody else is leading the effort for the Supreme Court, and somebody else is leading the other effort, and we might be able to participate in that work, we have a better chance of being effective. So that's where we have to really be discerning about what is the role that we can play, and what can we do to actually help move towards transformation. I think too often, and it's great that you have this group, we don't work together to do these things. And what we end up doing is everybody tries to do something, instead of thinking about if we actually work together, we would have a greater impact.
Well, I appreciate Dr. Powe. I just not bifurcating the either or, resisting that. That's so hard to do. I spend too much time on Twitter, and Twitter encourages us to just block people, follow some, block others, and sometimes that's good for our mental health. I don't want, sometimes blocking people on social media is really good, but there's a lot of discomfort right now to try not to pigeonhole people, try not to stereotype folks on issues, and it's hard. It's a hard place to be as a pastor sometimes, because it can seem like we're trying to navigate a really iffy middle ground. And yet people seem to need moral resources too. Like the people out there are in a similar place, are trying to figure out what to believe and what to do about the things that we're wrestling with. So, I mean, do you think churches are called to be sometimes in that middle space as we think about our faithful next step? I give an example here in Hyattsville that, I've been with a group of chaplains doing dialogue with the City of Hyattsville Police Department, and it's led to some really cool conversations around mental health and some pilot programs that are going to be happening here. So it's a celebration, and yet I have church members who have, of course, had very negative experiences with police, and are feeling the need for there to be change, and I join them in that need for change, for systemic change. And so it's sometimes really awkward to be in that room with the chief of police, and yet carry those folks with me and see the limitations and all that stuff and want change. It's just tough.
No, it's a great question. I appreciate it. It's good to see you. It's been a while. I think a couple of things are important, and I'm going to start sort of where you ended with that example. I mean, I think then part of what we have to discern is there a way to take what I'm calling the next faithful step with the police chief and those individuals where you can bring them together to say, yes, there have been some things that have been done, but we can say this is the reality of what we're still experiencing. And we know you can't wave a magic wand. I mean, this is the other thing. We have to be really clear. Even the chief of police is one person. He can't wave a magic wand and make everything perfect. That's not going to happen. If that's what people are expecting, then, there's a false sense of what's going to happen. But is there a way that we can start, again, moving towards something that will change the way things are happening? And what will it take to do that? So it's not just you carrying sort of those people with you, but how is it that you can sort of facilitate, going back to Reverend Brown's thing, a conversation with the police chief and those individuals that can possibly lead towards doing that? So I think And in that sense, you know, you have an important role to play that I don't think is sort of, I'm going to now to where you think, where you're not trying to play both sides, but you're genuinely trying to find a way to make a difference realistically for people to move forward. And I think, you know, that's critically important. And then the second thing I would say is, I think what, and this goes to where I sort of started, and I really don't have a great answer for this, but I think that what has become really challenging culture, and again, I'm not going to pick one side, is that it's easy to sort of preach from a perspective of what I support, you know, and just to hammer away at the other side, and not sort of ever, you know, try to paint a picture of, you know, why is it people believe that COVID is not real? Now, it doesn't mean that we're going to buy into saying COVID is not real, but do we ever seriously engage of why it is some people may believe that is the case, to actually help people understand why individuals may have this perspective? And again, I don't know that's taking a middle ground, but we are trying to help people understand why it is people hold certain views. And then we think about, then what is it that we can do, given that that's the perspective, as we try to do the work we're doing to make a difference. So I think that, again, it's not the church sort of trying to be wishy-washy, but it is sort of, we do have to sort of seriously try to engage and think about these things in a different way, instead of just saying, you know, this is the, you know, if we just present them scientific facts, they got to believe it. Well, that's not working, right? I mean, it's not helping.
If I could just throw in a little comment, it didn't come up in our small group, but I just moved down here from Massachusetts last summer after living here some 20 years. And we were working, and I say we, it was like a whole bunch of groups, NAACP, the Human Rights Commission, No Place for Hate. We were working with the police up in Barnstable County. And I just want to throw this out as a church place, I think, to be in part of in dialogue and in teaching, and that is to teach nonviolent communication. In Boston, there's a center, a nonviolent communication center, and we had them come out. And, you know, again, it's how we talk to each other in the moment. And that really helps. And I think it makes sense for churches to do that as a part of faith formation. And the other thing, I just want to say that I went to some ecumenical disaster preparedness workshop out at New Windsor quite a long time ago. Some of you might have even been there. And Professor Jameson lectured about it. And he said, whatever happens, it's going to be beyond our imagination, the next disaster. And he drew on, and to me, this is the short form of having faith. He drew on improv theater. And he said, you know, as persons of faith, it has to be about yes and, rather than yes, but. And again, as we develop relationships and can work together, we get a lot more of the yes ands. And again, how we express our view initially, which I would contend we can do in a more open-minded, nonviolent way, allows for the yes ands. And that's where I've hung my hat anyway. And even with the police dialogues, that's been helpful. So just something I wanted to contribute.
Thank you.
As a former police chief, it just struck me, and you know, we have police chief has dual roles. One is to support his employees, but also the second is to create a culture and change within the department to bring them appropriately. And it's sometimes difficult when you're having these dialogues to make sure that you're trying to be true to both roles. It's sort of like when we ask the regional minister, he has a role as far as when it comes to disciplining ministers, but he also has a role in supporting ministers, and they sometimes come in conflict with one another.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you. And that's why I say we got to be, we have to be realistic, help people understand that that one person is not going to wave a magic wand and make everything right. That's just, I mean, it's, you know, that's not going to happen. Are there others? I know we're a little bit over time, but I have time for a couple more questions. Well, if not, thank you all. Oh, go ahead.
Dr. Powe, I can jump back in with one more thing.
Sure.
I mean, I think this would be interesting for others to reflect on is, I don't know that I don't know that I have ever formally ever listened to my congregation about their eschatological viewpoint, what they really believe. And I've heard in bits that some people feel like things are just getting worse. And that things are going to get worse before they get better, and that some people think, oh, things are getting better. So I'd be just open that up. I just think that's an interesting way to frame it, because I think maybe then that would help us understand, well, what perspective our congregation brings to these conversations.
Yeah, and then it's also a chance to hopefully paint a picture for them of new possibilities, you know, based off of what you hear. So, yeah. Well, let me say I really appreciate being with you all, and the work that you all are doing, and hopefully will be doing in leading during these times, because and I say this honestly, of being every day it seems like something pops up. So I do hope that you will work together and find ways not to, you know, try to burn yourselves out, but find ways you can really make a difference in the things where you can have an impact. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kasim. Thank you, Elizabeth.